Chapter 2. Damn. Crazy bitch driving up Mount Blue in a snowstorm in a little e-car and with no winter gear. He should have just left her in the snowdrift to die. Tom McEnroe eased the woman onto the passenger side seat of his hovercraft, frowning. He hated the thought of taking any outsider to the base, but this was a no-brainer. He had to know who the fuck this woman was because she knew his name. She knew his fucking name. Nobody knew his name. It had been wiped from all public records when he joined Ghost Ops. Members of Ghost Ops had no relatives, no family, no friends. It was one of the conditions of joining. It made them better operatives. No distractions, no connections, no attachments. But this woman knew his name. She was looking for him. This was serious shit too, because every damn law enforcement agency was looking for him too. Not to mention the entire U.S. military. And they weren't going to be tender with him and his men when they found him. He got into the driver's seat and pressed the button for ignition. The baby started up with a purr. There was an airplane's engine in the hovercraft. It was powerful and silent and super classified. John and Nick had liberated it from a top-secret base a couple of months ago, and it was worth its weight in gold. He turned the heat up to maximum, draped the woman with a thermal blanket, and switched the seat heating up to high. He ran back to her vehicle. Snow had nearly filled the footwell on the driver's side. He grabbed her purse and a small case she had on the passenger seat and ran back to his vehicle, leaving the door open. The car was trashed anyway. An EMP had taken out all the circuits, and nothing short of a new engine would make it run. He'd send some men out after the snowstorm to bring it into their communal yard. She was tugging at the restraints when he got back. "Stop that," he said. And she stilled instantly. Smart woman. He was dangerous when he was pissed, and she could probably read that in his voice. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, working hard to keep the tremor out of her voice. He had to give her marks for courage. She wasn't screaming and crying to be let go, flailing about trying to hit him. He didn't have any chemical restraints with him, and this weather strained even his driving skills. He'd have to knock her out if she interfered with his driving. He wouldn't like it, but he'd do it. "I'm taking you somewhere warm for starters, Dr. Young," she quieted. Mac looked down at the IDs he had in his hand, taken from her purse. California driver's license, 2 credit cards, company security pass, medical insurance hologram, all made out to Dr. Catherine Young. She worked for a company called Milan Laboratories. He had no idea if she was a medical doctor or a scientist. No matter, he'd find out soon enough. For the moment, they needed to get back fast. Mac pressed the button that lifted the vehicle, moved the directional stick forward, and glided off the road and in the direction that would take them back to headquarters. Catherine didn't realize they had moved until she was pressed against the back of her seat. For a second, her befogged brain thought the man in black was pushing her, but that wasn't right. He was next to her. She could hear him breathe, feel his heat. They were in a vehicle that made no noise and crazily seemed to glide. The road she'd been on, track more than road, had been rutted, studded with stones, slippery with snow. One of the many mysteries that would be cleared up, or not. There was absolutely nothing Catherine could do, so she did the only thing she could, sit still and wait. They traveled for a long time, though she had no way of knowing exactly how long. Maybe she was traveling toward Tom McEnroe, as she was compelled to do. Maybe she was traveling to her death. Maybe she was traveling to both. However much she tried to avoid the bitter consequences of her gift, it had led her to this moment in which she was as powerless as a stick carried by a raging river down to the sea. She was hooded and her hands were restrained, but she wasn't uncomfortable and she wasn't cold. The strange vehicle was warm, and the man had thrown a blanket over her. It was very thin, almost like a cotton sheet, but underneath it she was incredibly warm. It was a lucky thing she wasn't suffering from severe hypothermia. People died from rewarming collapse, a sudden drop in blood pressure that sends the system into deep shock, then death. They rode in silence. For one of the few times in her life, Catherine was tempted to just reach out and touch the driver, skin against skin. She never touched anyone if she could help it. Often the results were painful, sometimes dangerous. Her hands were bare. Bringing her restrained hands over and touching him would at least tell her if he meant her harm, if if she was being driven to her death. If his mind was filled with hatred and violence, as many minds were, she'd fight to the death when they got out of the vehicle. There was nowhere she could be sure to touch his skin. He seemed to be covered all over in that light, tough material, including his hands. Once again, her gift was useless, dangerous, driving her to danger, but giving her no way out of it. She could do nothing but sit and try to keep her heartbeat calm and slow, try to empty her mind of all thought, try to just be. If she was going to fight to the death at the end of this ride, she couldn't afford to waste energy on useless speculation. She was on a mission to find this Tom McEnroe, propelled by forces beyond her control, and, God help her, propelled by overwhelming love for this McEnroe, for a man she'd never met. Mac drove into the base of HQ, entering a vast cavern. Their security was tight. He designed it himself, but the remote sensors situated along the hidden route to the mouth of the cavern recognized the ID signals given off by the hovercraft. If they hadn't, an electromagnetic pulse would have shut the vehicle down well before it came within sight of the hidden entrance, the same EMP that had fried her car's circuits. And if by some wild chance the vehicle didn't stop dead, whoever was manning the security monitors would give the order to one of their drones overhead, and a tiny, powerful precision missile would be unleashed that would leave a smoking crater and splashes of protoplasm and nothing else. The hovercraft stopped, the cushions dropping to the concrete floor. Mac got out and opened the passenger side door. The woman, Dr. Catherine Young, sat still and unmoving. He would have thought her a statue if it weren't for the slight trembling of her hands. They were beautiful hands, he had to admit, and she was a beautiful woman. No doubt about that either. That made him uneasy. Beautiful women were trouble, always. The woman he'd pulled out of the freezing car had been white-faced with cold, startled, then terrified. And with all that, so beautiful he'd taken her for a model. Some airhead, both stupid and crazy, because otherwise what the fuck would she be doing on their deliberately crap, almost impassable road at night in the middle of a snowstorm? She wasn't an airhead, she was a doctor, so that left crazy. What the fuck did she think she was doing? He'd been about ready to invent some story about being out hunting and being caught in the snowstorm, and offering to drive her back to Regent, 40 miles back down the mountain, when she dropped her bomb. I'm looking for Tom McEnroe. Mac didn't do surprise, but that was a real shocker. After dropping the bomb, there was no question of driving the clueless pretty civilian back down the mountain. She wasn't a civilian, and she wasn't there by chance. This was one dangerous woman. A woman who knew where to look for him when the entire U.S. government didn't have a clue. She was possibly a spy, definitely a threat, and she wasn't leaving their compound until he knew who had sent her and why, and how the hell she knew where to look in the first place. And he wouldn't bet on her leaving the compound alive. Out, he said. Mac trained hard men to do hard things. He trained men he knew perfectly well would be sent straight into lethal danger. They'd stay alive only if he trained them hard. Under fire, team cohesion was everything, and he was team leader. He was used to being instantly obeyed because he had to be instantly obeyed. The alternative was death, and not a good one either. So his command voice was the voice of God, screamed straight into his men's ears. Normally he moderated his command voice for women, but right then he was mad and suspicious. He wasn't about to moderate his voice for someone who might be endangering his entire world, no matter how pretty she was. Her whole body shrank in on itself at that one barked word, which was the reaction of any small animal to a threat from a larger animal. Hunker down, become small. Then, to his astonishment, the woman straightened up, head high under the hood, shoulders back, visibly trying to give herself courage. Well, shit, Matt recognized that. He knew all about trying to give yourself courage in bad situations. He'd been a prisoner of fundamentalist fucks in Yemen for 2 hellish months, in which he'd been kept hooded and uncertain, knowing that at any moment he'd have a blade to his throat or a muzzle to the back of his head. He knew precisely what she was feeling because he'd felt it himself. If she was going to clock out, she wanted to go out with her head high. Man, he knew what that was like, knew it inside out. For a second, just a fleeting moment, he identified with her, flashed on what this must be like for her. But then it passed. Fuck that. He couldn't afford to let himself feel anything for this woman. She'd come to him, found him against all the odds. She'd cracked security designed by 3 men who were the world's greatest experts, and he had no idea how she'd done it. She was a menace to him, to his men, and to this crazy community they'd gathered around themselves. Come, he said, injecting impatience in his voice. He had to interrogate her as soon as possible. If this woman, however soft and pale and helpless she looked, turned out to be the tip of the spear of an invasion, he and his men had to scramble. The faster he found out what she wanted and who was behind her, the better he could defend them. She swung her legs out the open door, feeling for the ground with one booted foot. At least she'd had the sense to wear woolen pants and boots. Though her legs looked like they went up to her neck, she was only a medium height. Her foot tapped down tentatively, seeking firm ground. Finally, exasperated, Mac fit his hands around her small waist and bodily lifted her out and down to the ground. Like a dancer, she pointed one foot at the ground and seemed to land like some damn ballerina. She felt good between his hands. Damn. Shocked, Mac took a long step back. He had no business thinking that way. He was a soldier now and forever. He hadn't left the military. The military had left him. At heart, he was still a soldier, protecting his own, and this woman represented danger. The fuck did he care if she felt light and graceful under his hands? If she was beautiful, if she was brave, that made her doubly dangerous. Bravery in an adversary was bad juju, he knew that. Was sex messing with his head? Never had before. Sex was off the table when he was on a mission, and his entire life now was a mission, dawn to dusk. Of course, sex had been easy to dismiss when he'd actually been getting laid, which was not the case right now and hadn't been for a year. Man, if this woman could distract him, he needed to do something about that ASAP. Get down off the mountain one night in one of their camouflaged vehicles, go to some dive in one of the nearby towns that didn't have vidcams, and find himself a woman for the night, or for however long it took to get this out of his system. She was standing quietly, head high, the only sign of stress an accelerated rate of breathing and the trembling of her hands. Come with me, Max said roughly, and took her elbow, setting off toward the huge elevator that would take them 1/2 mile straight up. She came obediently, which was smart of her. He didn't think he could hurt a woman, but he didn't want to put that to the test. He was the front line of defense not only for his men, but for the Haven, and if he had to choose between this woman and those he protected, she'd lose. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. Best case scenario, keep her in isolation, extract what intel he could, particularly how she knew his name and in what general direction to find him, what she wanted, who sent her. John had a drug he lifted from a pharmaceutical wholesaler that could wipe short-term memories. Couple the drug with a light anesthetic, have her wake up 100 miles away with no memory of him, or Mount Blue, or Haven. He tugged on her arm and she stopped obediently, while he pressed the button to open the elevator doors. When they opened, he urged her forward with his hand pressed to her back. The engineer who designed the elevator, Eric Dane, had had fun with velocity. You never know it, but the damn thing shot up more than 2,000 feet in 30 seconds. It was a wonder nobody got the bends. Dane was one of his strays. The engineer had gone underground when he'd blown the whistle on structural deficiencies he'd found on the Oakland Bay Bridge and had lost his job for the efforts. 2 months after, he'd filed a report with the authorities on the bridge's weaknesses. It had collapsed on the Oakland end after the mild 2021 quake. 40 people died. Dane's structural deficiencies report was wiped from the company files, and he was blamed for the collapse. A multi-million-dollar suit was brought against him, but there was no one to sue. He disappeared. One more in Mac's ragtag army of outlaws and runaways, men and women who had come under his protection. Dane had buffered the takeoff and slowdown at the top, so the woman would have no way of judging how far they'd come. For all she knew, they climbed a few stories in a building instead of shooting up 1/2 mile inside a mountain. The doors opened silently. The hoods baffled sounds, so she wouldn't be able to tell that the elevator opened onto their huge atrium, which was their community's central square. There were 4 people in sight, working. One of them was John, who looked curiously at Mac holding onto the elbow of a hooded woman. Mac signaled with his head to the right, to their meeting room. He made the universal sign of a camera rolling, and John nodded and took off. Max steered the woman through the benches and plants of their huge open space, knowing not much was penetrating the hood, not sounds or lights or smells. As always, a huge spurt of pride blossomed in his chest when he came out into their outlaw community's central square. It was beautiful. Mac got a real lift every time he crossed the square. It was filled with light day and night. During the day, the molecule-thick, totally impenetrable ceiling looked open to the sky and blazed with sunlight. Minuscule solar collectors around the rim flooded the square with light at night. The solar panels were also heaters at the touch of a button. The effect was startling. High overhead, sheets of snow fell from the sky and stopped, disappearing the instant they touched the screen. There was greenery everywhere, lush, thriving plants that pleased the eye and gave off a fresh fragrance. Fruit trees, flower beds, glossy shrubs, small enclaves of grass. The lush greenery was thanks to Manuel Rivera, the man with the golden hands. John met him when he went tomcatting in Carden, a small town 60 miles away. They became friends. Manuel was working 18 hours a day trying to get his organic farm produce business off the ground. John found himself growing fond of the guy. On one trip in a town, the owner of the bar John always stopped at told him Manuel had been attacked by muggers, had refused to go to the local hospital, and was in a room upstairs. John ran upstairs, kicked open the door, took one look at Manuel, stopped the bleeding, lifted him over his shoulder, and brought him up the mountain, defying Mac and Nick. By that time, though, Mac and Nick were resigned. The ragtag community already counted Dane, a famous actress whose face had been slashed by a stalker, an ER nurse who'd had to turn away a pregnant woman with preeclampsia and no insurance, and about 40 other refugees from modern life. Manuel had sued a big agro business with test fields of genetically modified plants next to his, contaminating his organic produce. The day after the lawsuit was filed, 2 thugs had beaten him up, leaving torn up pieces of the lawsuit fluttering down onto his blood on the ground. The agro business was an offshoot of Arca Pharmaceuticals. Manuel now filled their public spaces with plants and ran 2 huge fields of orchards and vegetables, which provided them all with organic, fresh fruit and vegetables. In exile and hunted like animals, they ate like kings. The lush greenery reminded Mac of what he was fighting for and why he had to be wary with this woman. Everyone else at Haven had found their way here by accident and by fate. This woman had come specifically for him. Mac opened the door of their meeting room and ushered her over the threshold. John would have already seeded the room with vid cams, tiny ones she wouldn't be able to detect. John and Nick would be watching from next door. The woman stood quietly just inside the room. She didn't pester him to let her go. Didn't ask where they were. He found that interesting. It showed self-discipline. Was she an operator? Only one way to find out. He pulled off his balaclava, tapped his wrist unit twice, unlocking her restraints, and whipped off her hood. She blinked in the light, getting her bearings. Mac watched her carefully. People see different things. Operators are always on. They don't sign up by chance. They're born that way, hardwired for trouble, then drift to where someone can train them and hone their gifts. An operator would walk into a baby's nursery, check the exits and the kid's hands in his crib, just in case. So if she was here on an infiltration mission, she'd check his hands, check the door to see what kind of locking mechanism it had, check all the walls for windows and see what could possibly be used as a weapon. She'd do it fast, and in about a second and a half she could list in detail every single item in the room. Mac could do it. John and Nick could do it. They'd been taught by the best by Lucius Ward. At the thought of his former commanding officer, Mac's heart gave a small pump of rage. He repressed the thought ruthlessly. Now wasn't the time. It would never be the time. And anyway, the fucker was living it up in Rio. The woman didn't size up the room at all. She sized him up. Her gaze rested thoughtfully on his face without even a flicker of attention to his hands. Even though his hands hovered over his Beretta 92 and the black carbon combat knife in its sheath, The knife was 300 times stronger than steel. He could not just slit her throat, but he could decapitate her without any effort at all. An operator would have understood that instinctively, would have upped the vigilance level, started dancing on the balls of her feet in anticipation of action. Nothing like that. She simply stood before him, looking him in the eyes, breathing regular, muscles relaxed, hands loose. And crash, she was beautiful. Right now, that was the only thing in favor of her being an operator. Services throughout the world were scrambling to recruit beautiful athletic women, sometimes training them from high school on. Honeypots, they were called, and they were spectacularly effective. Ghost Stops had 2 such women available. In training to make it up to the big leagues, women so beautiful any straight man would let them get near because biology tripped them up. Conquest by hormones. The men the women preyed on never felt the knife that slipped between the ribs, or the garrote around the neck, or the microbullet between the eyes. But Francesca and Melanie had a look about them that was unmistakable. They could hide the fact that they were soldiers under fashionable clothes and makeup, but they couldn't hide the fact that they were dangerous. If a man had eyes to see, they gave off danger vibes like beautiful rattlesnakes. Nothing like the aura around this woman. She was too soft, too sad. This woman wasn't a predator. She looked vulnerable and tired. Fuck this. Sit down, he rapped. She looked around and took one of his easy chairs at the table they used for one-on-ones, ignoring the long table they used for meetings. He sat down across from her. If he shifted his knees, he'd be touching her. He sank into the softness of his chair, making sure he didn't touch her, wishing he didn't have to do this, wishing he didn't have to be here interrogating this woman, knowing he'd have to make some hard choices if her story wasn't convincing. Because he was the protector of his outlaw band, and if he had to get rid of her to keep them all safe, he'd do it. He wouldn't like it, but he'd do it. By default, he'd been appointed king of his little kingdom, and though he'd rather be anywhere else, here he was in his comfy easy chair. As a soldier, he'd never have allowed easy chairs in his office. Nothing easy about being a soldier. The harder the life, the faster you learned. He had a PhD in hardship. But here, damn, if people didn't come to him with their problems. They're fucking civilians. Much as he'd like to, he couldn't order them to stand to attention and give a sit rep. The civilian world didn't work like that. So he'd learned to offer his people a comfortable chair and even a damn cup of coffee. He drew the line at tea, waiting for them to get to the point. She sat there, not relaxed against the back of her chair, but not tensely poised on the edge of her seat either. She simply looked at him, as if waiting. Okay, so he'd start the dance. Who the fuck are you, and why are you looking for this guy? What the hell was his name? She never blinked. Tom McEnroe, I'm looking for Tom McEnroe. Mac had been trained to lie by the best. His eyes gave absolutely nothing away. Never heard of him, he said, and who are you? I'm not going to ask a third time, lady. She drew in a deep breath, and he kept his eyes on her face. Because for a slender woman, she had a really great rack. Which had nothing to do with anything, of course, just an observation. He was definitely going to head down the mountain next week and get laid, though. My name is Catherine Young, she said quietly, Dr. Catherine Young. I am a neuroscientist, and I work in a research lab, Milan Laboratories, about 20 miles north of Palo Alto. All of which you obviously read from documents in my purse. I am also an expert on dementia. She stopped as if giving him time to react. Max simply waited. Dementia, huh? Maybe that was his problem. He was demented for not knocking her out and leaving her 300 miles away from here. Yeah, he was losing it. He couldn't see it, but he knew John was tapping away at his virtual keyboard. The woman had barely finished talking when John's voice came in over the invisible earpod. She's telling the truth, boss. Catherine Ann Young, born August 8, 1995. Lives on University Road, Palo Alto. Low whistle. Got more degrees than my dog has fleas. Cum laude, too. That is one smart lady. I'm looking at her driver's license, photo matches, and am now looking at her company ID. Milan Labs. It all checks out. Mac gave an almost imperceptible nod. Which she wouldn't catch, but John would. Then John came back on. Whoa. Boss, Mila, and the company she works for, it's owned by Futura Technology and goes through the final owner of Futura is. John sometimes got carried away with his own smarts. Matt could almost see himself smacking himself on the forehead because of course Matt couldn't answer. Sorry, boss, Arca Pharmaceuticals, that's who. Our luscious Dr. Young ultimately works for Arca. Arca Pharmaceuticals, their last mission. He and John and Nick had almost died on that mission, and it had made them outlaws. The false intel that Arca Pharmaceuticals was working on a weaponized form of Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, had cost them everything. Because there had been no plague, only some very bright scientists working on a cure for cancer. Because the mission had cost him his entire team, only he, John, and Nick had escaped. And because he and his entire team had been betrayed by their commander, a man they had all loved. That was Arca Pharmaceuticals, and that was the company this woman ultimately worked for. Meg didn't believe in coincidences. She might look soft, she might not be an operator in the technical sense, and she might well be a doctor with degrees coming out of her ears, but his first instinct was correct. This woman was dangerous. Go on. She'd stopped and continued studying his face as if it was giving something away. Good luck with that, his face didn't give anything away. I work mainly in the lab. Pause, side note. Description of coverage. $500,000 worldwide automatic travel accident insurance provided to Visa, Gold, MasterCard cardholders at no extra cost by your bank card center. Plan Administrator Insurance Consultants, Inc., 13215 Birch Drive, Suite 100, Omaha, Nebraska, 68164. Plan underwritten by Federal Insurance Company, a member insurer of the CHUBB, CHUBB, Group of Insurance Companies, 15 Mountain View Road, P.O. Box 1615, Warren, New Jersey, 07061-1615. The plan. As a Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard cardholder of bank card services, you, your spouse, and your dependent children will be automatically insured against accidental loss of life, limb, sight, speech, or hearing while riding as a passenger in, entering, or exiting any licensed common carrier, provided the entire cost of the passenger fare or fares, less redeemable certificates, vouchers, or coupons has been charged to your Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard card account. If the entire cost of the passenger fare has been charged to your Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard card account prior to departure for the airport, terminal, or station, coverage is also provided for common carrier travel, including taxi, bus, train, or airport limousine, but not including courtesy transportation provided without a specific charge. A. Immediately preceding your departure directly to the airport, terminal, or station. B. While at the airport, terminal, or station. And C. Immediately following your arrival at the airport, terminal, or station of your destination. If the entire cost of the passenger fare has not been charged prior to your arrival at the airport, terminal, or station, coverage begins at the time the entire cost of the travel passenger fare is charged to your Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard card account. Common carrier means any land, water, or air conveyance operated by those whose occupation or business is the transportation of persons without discrimination and for hire. There's a little asterisk for children. Dependent children means unmarried children who are primarily dependent upon the insured for maintenance and support and who are under the age of 19 and reside with the insured beyond the age of 19 who are permanently mentally or physically challenged and incapable of self-support, or up to the age of 23 if classified as a full-time student at an institute of higher learning. Description of coverage. Eligibility. This travel insurance plan is provided to Visa Gold and Gold MasterCard cardholders of bank card services automatically when the entire cost of the passenger fares are charged to your Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard account while the insurance is effective. It is not necessary for you to notify bank card services, the administrator, or the insurance company when tickets are purchased. The cost. This travel insurance plan is provided at no additional cost to eligible Visa Gold and Gold MasterCard card holders of BankCard Services. BankCard Services pays the account holder's premium. Beneficiary. The loss of life benefit will be paid to the beneficiary designated by the insured. If no such designation has been made, that benefit will be paid to the first surviving beneficiary in the following order: A, the insured spouse; B, the insured's children; C, the insured's parents; D, the insured's brothers and sisters; E, the insured's estate. All other indemnities will be paid to the insured. The benefits. The full benefit amount is payable for accidental loss of life, 2 or more members, sight of both eyes, speech and hearing, or any combination thereof. 1/2 of the benefit amount is payable for accidental loss of 1 member, sight of 1 eye, speech or hearing, member means hand or foot. 1/4 of the benefit amount is payable for the accidental loss of the thumb and index finger of the same hand. Loss means, with respect to a hand, complete severance through or above the knuckle joint of at least 4 fingers on the same hand. With respect to a foot, complete severance through or above the ankle joint. The company will consider it a loss of hand or foot even if they are later reattached. Benefit amount means the loss amount applicable at the time the entire cost of the passenger fares is charged to a Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard account. The loss must occur within 1 year of the accident. The company will pay the single largest applicable benefit amount. In no event will duplicate request forms or multiple charge cards obligated the insurance company in excess of the stated benefit amounts for any one loss sustained by any one individual insured as the result of any one accident. Exclusions. This insurance does not cover loss resulting from 1. An insured's emotional trauma, mental or physical illness, disease, pregnancy, childbirth or miscarriage, bacterial or viral infection, except bacterial infection caused by an accident or from accidental consumption of a substance contaminated by bacteria, or bodily malfunctions. 2. Suicide, attempted suicide, or intentionally self-inflicted injuries. 3. Declared or undeclared war, but war does not include acts of terrorism. This insurance also does not apply to an accident occurring while an insured is in, entering, or exiting any aircraft, while acting or training as a pilot or crew member, but this exclusion does not apply to passengers who temporarily perform pilot or crew functions in a life-threatening emergency. Effective date. This insurance is effective February 1st, 1990 and will cease on the date the master policy number 6404-65-23 is terminated, or on the date your Visa Gold or Gold MasterCard account ceases to be in good standing, whichever occurs first. Answers to specific questions can be obtained by writing the plan administrator. To make a claim, please contact the plan administrator. And then a little note, as a handy reference guide, please read this and keep it in a safe place with your other insurance documents. This description of coverage is not a contract of insurance, but is simply an informative statement of the principal provisions of the insurance while in effect. Complete provisions pertaining to this plan of insurance are contained in the master policy on file with the policyholder. BankCard Services. If this plan does not conform to your state statutes, it will be amended to comply with such laws. If a statement in the description of coverage and any provision in the policy differ, the policy will govern. Sorry about that. A little side note. Back to Heart of Danger. Go on. She'd stopped and continued studying his face as if it was giving something away. Good luck with that. His face didn't give anything away. I work mainly in the lab, but we have a ward of test subjects suffering from severe rapid onset dementia. Men and women who are so far gone they can't remember their names, can't remember anything about their past. Some are barely sentient. We're working on a cure for dementia, a way to reestablish the synapses that have been lost. I'll spare you the technical details. Our protocols are highly experimental, very cutting edge, but several offer a great deal of promise. Each test subject was informed of the risks at a time when 2 neurologists certified that they were of sound mind. Side note, on that number 2, there were 2 typos in that little bit in that side note section that I never noticed before, and that's the kind of thing I would definitely have noticed, so it's strange. Anyway, back to the book. At a time when 2 neurologists certified that they were of sound mind and each patient signed a release, or failing that, a family member with power of attorney signed. The patients were assigned numbers, which I would have objected to, but they were all well beyond recognizing their own names. There was one patient in the protocol group, however, known as number 9. Her voice trailed off and she looked down at her hands, trying to think of what to say next. Mac let the silence go on for a while. Finally, he made an impatient gesture with his hand. Number 9? What was the matter with patient number 9, besides being nearly brain dead? Her eyes lifted. She had truly beautiful eyes. A light gray, rimmed with a circle of darker gray, surrounded by amazingly long, thick eyelashes. Possibly even her own, since she didn't seem to be wearing makeup. Shit, what was the matter with him? Letting him be distracted by pretty eyes during an interrogation that might have life or death consequences. Lack of sex wasn't an excuse. There wasn't any excuse. He forced himself to focus. She just stared at him. Her face was soft, open, vulnerable. Much as Mac wanted to read operational awareness and craft in her expression, he simply wasn't seeing it. Everything he'd ever learned about interrogation techniques was signaling something impossible. Either she was very, very good, better than anyone he'd ever come across, or the woman wasn't lying, was no threat to him. Except she'd come looking for him in a snowstorm, for him specifically. Of course she was a fucking threat. Dr. Young? She started slightly, as if she'd gone into a trance. There were white brackets around her mouth, and her nostrils were pinched. She'd driven up a mountain in a snowstorm and had nearly gone into hypothermia. She'd be exhausted. Now that he thought of it, he looked for signs of exhaustion and found them. She was swaying lightly in her chair as if sitting up straight took effort. Mac had a thin membrane on his left forearm, which was a keypad. He pulled up the sleeve of his sweater and typed under the table, "Bring food and something hot to drink in 30 minutes," and nearly smiled at the treat awaiting this woman who didn't deserve it. They had the best chef in the world here at Haven. He lifted his hands up from under the table and gestured impatiently. What about this number 9? Who was he? Number 9 was a large man, 53 years of age, according to his file, though he looked much older. Dementia patients often look 10, even 20 years older than they are. They are incapable of looking after themselves and age rapidly. Number 9's file said he was a business executive who had worked for a succession of companies, the turnover being extremely rapid in the previous 4 years. This is consistent with a diagnosis of a dementing disorder. He'd be hired on the basis of his track record, then the company would discover he wasn't up to the job. And then soon, of course, the track record was one of failure. Divorce, no children. His medical plan didn't cover a shelter home. He enrolled himself in the program while he was still capable of signing documents. Everything was normal, if anything about these patients can be considered normal. Her eyes flicked to a pitcher and she cleared her throat. "May I have a glass of water?" He poured her a glass and she drank, that long white throat bobbing. When Mac realized he was avidly watching her drink, he turned his gaze away. Christ. "Thank you." She put the glass down and smiled at him. He didn't smile back. It wasn't a smiling kind of situation. But as smiles went, hers was 1,000 on a scale of 1 to 10. Slightly shy, warm, creating a tiny dimple on her left cheek. Oh, fuck me. Get back on track. So, something about this guy, this number 9, didn't add up. There was something about him. Yes, that was unusual. We have developed a semi-portable functional MRI, and we use it to track changes in the patient's brain scans, seeing what stimulates various parts of the brain, particularly under the drug protocol. Dementia has many origins. Sometimes it is a series of mini-strokes that choke off oxygen to sections of the brain, making them essentially dead tissues. Alzheimer's is the result of plaque that tangles the synapses, exactly as if the brain gums up. All of these have distinct fMRI signatures. Number 9 had something else altogether. The brain scan of this patient made no sense to me. His brain was damaged in a completely new way. The clinical symptoms were consistent with dementia, but the scans weren't. Dementia patients have a general overall degradation of function due either to apoxia or plaque in the case of Alzheimer's, mainly centered around the hippocampus. Here I was seeing degradation of the striatum, unusually so. The patterns were strange. If I hadn't seen the patient myself, I would have said his brain had been destroyed by an outside force. A little like a cloak being thrown over the higher functions, but underneath the scan showed a great deal of activity like a banked fire. He tried to communicate verbally, but it wasn't working. He became exhausted. Dementia patients forget words. It didn't seem like this patient forgot words so much as was unable to physically get them out. Though Max still didn't see the connection, the fact that this was a company controlled by Arca Pharmaceuticals made it definitely his business. So what? You read his mind? His sarcasm got more of a reaction than he thought it would. She jerked slightly, eyes rounded. No, she drew in a deep breath. No, I didn't read his mind. They don't teach that at med school. I found the key by sheer chance. I was typing my notes onto my iPad when his head jerked. His eyes went from my pad to me and then back to the tablet. I turned my tablet around and was astonished when he started keying in letters. Okay, Max said, I'll bite. He wrote that I should say nothing and turn off the vid cams. I have a security code that allows me to do that, however, so it wouldn't alert the guards watching the monitors or any bots that might have been established. I simply created a loop of him sleeping. Smart thinking. Even if she wasn't an operator, she had some good moves in her. But then, Mac reflected, you don't get several PhDs by being dumb. From then on, we communicated laboriously by fits and starts over the course of 2 days. The first thing he told me is that his name wasn't the name we had in our files, Edward Domino, which immediately made me suspicious. Dementia can merge into psychosis easily, and dementing patients are often paranoid. I've had patients who insisted they were John Kennedy, George Washington, Marco Polo, Albert Einstein. So I was prepared to hear something preposterous, but he gave me another name which meant nothing to me. I have a feeling, however, that it might mean something to you. She stopped, looking at him. Mac turned his face to stone. She sighed. Lucius Ward. Holy shit, John's voice said in his ear. Mac could hear Nick swearing in the background. The name means nothing to me, Mac said, raising his eyebrows slightly. He felt as if he'd been sucker punched, but nothing showed on his face. Why should it? I have no idea. All I know is the fierce determination of this man. Whether he was Edward Domino or Lucius Ward makes no difference to me. He communicated with great difficulty. He sweated and he shook, but he wouldn't give up. He repeated his name and said I absolutely had to find Tom McEnroe. That's a direct quote. He spent an hour, white-faced with fatigue, telling me this. He also gave me something. She dug in a pants pocket and brought something out in a small fist. She tossed it onto the table, where it rolled a few times, then stopped a few inches from Mac's hand. He stared at it, barely able to breathe. Jesus Christ. This time it was Nick's voice coming in over his earbud. The captain's hawk. It looked like nothing. A tiny, almost invisible pin made of black metal. Only under a microscope could you see that it was beautifully detailed. The pin was a hawk in flight, perfectly crafted down to individual feathers, a tiny gold stripe running down its back. It was made from the barrel of the gun that had killed bin Laden. It was the badge of a ghost. Ghosts were banned from having flashes or insignia of any sort. They were even banned from wearing U.S. military uniforms. They were only allowed that one tiny badge smaller than a shirt button. There had been only 7 of them in the world, and only one with a thin stripe of gold. The one that belonged to the Ghost's commanding officer, Captain Lucius Ward. One thing Mac knew, traitor or no traitor, Lucius would have relinquished his hawk pin only on death, or in the direst emergency. Even if he'd betrayed his men, even if he'd sold them out, even if absolutely everything Mac thought he knew about Lucius was wrong, this one thing went wrong. It would take a cataclysm or death to pry Lucius's hawk from his fingers. Do you know what that is? She asked. He searched her eyes for irony, but found nothing. She was genuinely puzzled. Well, considering the fact that the existence of ghost ops was SCI, secret compartmented information, and that only a handful of people in the world knew about them, and even fewer knew of their secret badge, it was entirely possible she had no idea what the hawk was. No. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. Should I? I have no idea. She closed her hand over the hawk and held it casually, not knowing that the little metal pin represented blood, sweat, and tears on a vast scale, and was the symbol of a man Mac, John, and Nick had loved like a father. A man who'd betrayed them, who'd led them into a trap of fire, sacrificed them as casually as you'd swat at flies, for money. She sighed. He was trembling when he gave it to me, as if it were something that meant a great deal to him, but he was trembling before then anyway. The more we communicated, the more motor control he lost. She raised her eyes to his. Even more important than the badge, though it seems, was to find this Tom McEnroe and give him a message. And what message would that be? Mac asked, his voice casual, though his heart had begun a low, deep thumping inside his chest. This was way beyond what he had bargained for. The three of them had simply assumed Lucius disappeared with his money to some Caribbean island or some enclave in Southeast Asia. If there was one man in the world who knew how to disappear, it was Lucius Ward. He was a master of the art. They'd often bitterly speculated how he would be in some tropical paradise, a rich man, while they lived as outlaws. And then it turned out he was in some lab only 200 miles from here, hurt and sick. For a moment, Mac battled with himself. The idea of the boss, hurt and sick, and alone was impossible to bear. He could hardly sit in the same place with the thought, and his hands literally itched to get going, to go get the captain who was the man who had betrayed them. Mac had to keep reminding himself of that. The captain had betrayed them, led them into a trap, left them to die. She opened her hand and studied the small badge thoughtfully, as if answers could be found in it. He said, I had to find this Mac. She lifted her head, and Mac saw pain and sorrow in those huge gray eyes. He said when I found him to tell him Code Delta. I don't know what that means, but Mac did. Danger. The huge man leaned back in his chair, fist beating lightly on the desktop. Catherine's heart rate jumped, even though he wasn't giving off danger vibes. Or rather, though he looked dangerous, very dangerous, he didn't seem out of control, and he hadn't threatened her directly. Most violent men had their temper on a short leash. It took very little to set them off, and anything could do it. A wrong word, a wrong look. Catherine had dated a man once. They'd met in a bookshop reaching for the same book. They'd had coffee in the in-shop Starbucks, and he asked her out to dinner the next night. Catherine was wary of men, but he'd seemed so nice, soft-spoken, funny, and smart. They hadn't touched, but she liked him. They'd had a great meal. Back in his car, she decided to let him kiss her, and that she'd accept another dinner invitation, and maybe on the weekend she'd invite him over for lunch, nice and slow, the way she liked it. And he leaned over, fisted his hand in her hair, and kissed her hard, aggressively, opening her jaw with his other hand and thrusting with his tongue. He took her completely by surprise, and she resisted. He liked that. Oh, yeah, he liked that a lot. And what he was inside, under that nice, bland exterior, rushed like ice over her skin. Swirls of violence filled her head, red-tinted and hot. Sickness pulsed through her in nauseating waves, nearly overwhelming her. It had been there all along, and she hadn't seen it because she hadn't touched him. She recognized at his kiss that violence filled him as if his skin was a sack full to the brim with it. All it took was the slightest abrasion, and the skin broke, and aggression and violence came geysering out. She'd pushed at him and run to her small house, slamming the door behind her, panting, listening until finally she heard his car's tires squeal as he took off fast. That night had been like a watershed, the lowest point of her life. After slamming the door shut, she'd slid down the wall, huddling in on herself and trembling for hours. It had occurred to her for the first time that maybe this was it. It was never going to get better, ever. She'd misjudged the man because she kept herself so isolated, and she kept herself isolated because her gift poisoned the well whenever she wanted to get close to someone. The episode scared her so much she hadn't touched a man since, for fear she'd chance upon someone else just brimming with violence. Oh, no. Oh, that was Sophie Daniels. Her, that is the description of her gift, not Catherine. Anyway, the episode scared her so much she hadn't touched a man since, for fear she'd chance upon someone else just brimming with violence. That wasn't the impression she was getting here, though granted she wasn't touching him. What she got was impenetrable granite, massive self-control. What was under it was invisible to her. It might be violence, it might not, but whatever it wasn't going to come geysering out. It wasn't going to come out at all. She met his eyes. Women tended to look people in the eye, but some men interpreted that as aggression, as lack of respect, and responded accordingly. She didn't get the sense in any way that this man was out of control. On the contrary, every single line of his big body remained still, clearly leashed to his will, even though he was armed to the teeth. There was a big black gun strapped to his right thigh and a big black knife in a sheath on his other thigh. He didn't need them. His entire body was a weapon. There was power in every long line of him, leashed, potent, unmistakable. His winter wear was some kind of high-tech stuff, thin black, non-reflective material, and it showcased his body, one of the strongest bodies she'd ever seen. Extra wide shoulders tapering down to a lean waist, long powerful thighs, long arms and massive hands at the ends of them. This was truly a formidable man, and he'd glowered at her during the entire interrogation, fierce dark eyes fixed on hers, as if waiting to catch her out in a lie. Well, she was too steeped in neurolinguistics to make any mistakes in eye displacement, even if she were lying. She knew precisely the body language necessary to convey truthfulness. If she wanted to lie, only an fMRI would show it, because she couldn't force her brain to light up specific areas. She wasn't lying, so it wasn't an issue, but the quality of the man's attention was such that she was certain he'd unmask untruths coming from anyone he cared to unmask. His entire body language was still but wary. He didn't trust her, not an inch. Had she made any kind of aggressive or even evasive move, there was no doubt he'd have snake-fast reflexes, so she stayed still too. But now she'd fulfilled the mission a sick man had sent her on, one she'd been helpless to refuse. It was done, for better or worse. The tension was seeping out of her, and she had to force herself to stay upright in the chair and not slump with fatigue. Unfortunately, she was sitting on an amazingly comfortable chair, so maybe he didn't do interrogations on a regular basis in this room. Most interrogations took place in uncomfortable environments. She didn't look around, but she'd observed enough to know that it was a comfortable room, pleasant even. Interrogation rooms weren't supposed to be pleasant. They were supposed to be austere and forbidding. Sort of like a jail cell, which is where you went if you lied. What time was it? It must be close to midnight. She'd slept badly the past night, unnerved by patient 9. Patient 9, Lucius, had been so desperately insistent, the force of his will had simply washed over her, prickling her skin. The images coming from him had been so very strong, the strongest she'd ever had. As if the barriers between them had dissolved and she was in his damaged head. There were images there, true, not words, except for that one name, murmured brokenly, over and over again. Tom McEnroe. Mac. The images were clear. The mountain, lonely broken roads, obstacles, a dead car, and horrifyingly his own death. Cold stillness, his body on a steel gurney with runnels, a body laid out for an autopsy. Lucius Ward was ill, but not at death's door. His EEG was pathological, but his heart and lungs functioned well. But the image was insistent. He expected to die soon. He had been agitated yesterday, trying desperately to talk, clinging to her arm with an emaciated hand that still held surprising strength. His throat clicked over and over, words that weren't coming out, only a thin trickle of air escaping from his mouth with a short hum. His eyes bulged, the cords in his thin neck stretched. His mouth opened and closed with a clatter of teeth. His efforts to speak were so heartbreaking she couldn't stand him. Bending down to him, fixing his wild, desperate gaze, she bent her ear to his mouth. He managed one word. "Run," he whispered, and she'd broken out in goosebumps. Troubled, Catherine had gone home. She couldn't eat and couldn't sleep, and finally, the next morning, she decided to follow the pictures in her head. Something about the wild fear he had instilled kept her from calling in sick. She simply left. The man in black stood up suddenly and looked down at her. "Stay here," he commanded, and walked out. Stay here. Well, where would she go? The door opened for him and closed behind him before she could even think of making a break for it. She looked down at the tabletop. The grain of the wood was unusually fine, and she fixated on it until her head drooped. She jerked upright. She'd nearly fallen asleep in the chair. Were they going to keep her here all night? There were only 2 chairs. Maybe she could use the other chair for her legs and try to catch a few hours of uncomfortable sleep. She shifted uneasily, stiff and sore, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Hunger and thirst were added to the discomfort of exhaustion. She turned her head to eye the door. There was no doorknob. It had somehow swished open for the man in black and swished closed again, with no visible command having been given. There was no keypad, and even if there were, she didn't have the code. The door whooshed open again unexpectedly, and she turned in her chair, heart pounding, muscles tense for danger. But it wasn't danger. It was only a teenage boy holding a big tray. She was so surprised that by the time she thought to react, to engage the boy in a conversation, to try to pry some information out of him, he was gone, the door whooshing open and closed for him, as if invisible genies inhabited the place. A cornucopia lay before her. Her stomach rumbled loudly, the wonderful smell sparking some kind of intense endocrine reaction. Her hand trembled as she picked up the first thing close to her hand. A taco, but not just any taco, no. Maybe it was extreme hunger, but the tastes were incredible. Stone ground cornmeal, shell, fresh tomatoes, perfectly cooked spicy meat. Even the lettuce was delicious. The best homemade guacamole she'd ever tasted. A baked potato with fresh clotted cream and freshly chopped chives. A salad of tasty red tomatoes drizzled with extra virgin olive oil. A huge slice of the best peach pie she'd ever tasted. So good she nearly laughed aloud as she brought the fork to her mouth. A pitcher of absolutely fresh juice. She could taste apples and carrots and a touch of lemon. It went down her parched throat like a dream, and it was like being in a garden on a summer's day. Oh man, if they were going to kill her, at least they were serving her the best last meal ever.